Okay, why don't we get started? Feel free to munch away and carry on as you are. But I'd really like to welcome you to the academic year 18-19 City Forum. City Forum is the main colloquium speaker series within the Regional Planning Program. And it's been operating for 27 years nonstop as a variety-led forum. So it has a long history. And we have speakers from the School of Architecture, we have speakers from across campus, we have speakers from the community, and speakers from, on occasion, from around the United States and around the world. So it's we think it's a great forum because it really allows you as planning and architecture students to sort of see the faces of and see the real contours of the issues as they're kind of being vetted out or sorted out in the world. And you see the faces and the institutions associated with a lot of the activities that we're all engaged in. So you'll be getting notices like you got for this every week, and come, and if you want a lot of food, come early, a little early. But anyway, welcome, and we hope you'll find this a really great place to come on a Friday afternoon and relax a little bit and learn a little bit outside your academic work. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Mueller. Many of you know Liz. She works in housing, community development, issues of neighborhood change and transformation, discrimination. And of course she teaches in the CRP program. She's worked and published very widely on those issues, and she's been very, very engaged at the local level with local governmental and non-governmental nonprofit organizations. She served on a large number of boards and commissions for the city, including the Community Development Board and the Bond Review.
Housing Bond Review
Housing
Committee.
Bond Review Committee. Today she's really going to talk about an extremely interesting, important, and charged issue, and that is gentrification or neighborhood change and transformation in Austin, and how we can think about it in more innovative ways, and how we can maybe to some extent mitigate it or manage that process. And she is presenting today work hot off the press that was for the city of Austin. This is going to be presented to city officials and so on and so forth in a few weeks or so. So this is kind of our first glance at the findings. Liz worked on this project with Dr. Jake Wegman, who many of you all know, in the Community Regional Planning Program, and Heather Way, who is a professor at the University of Texas School of Law. And again, we're just in the process of releasing the report, so we're getting kind of a first look. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak. And as Michael said, I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on with Jake Wegman and Heather Way. It was also a project that several CRP students worked on, and one of them is in the room, Alice Woods, who is helping us right now because he said hot off the press. It's kind of like, still coming out of the press right now. We're still doing the final bits of editing on it. But it was a project that was inspired by conversations we began to have with some of the council offices, and they were really the ones that brought the idea to us. And the city council ultimately funded this, so they are the ones that we're reporting to at the end. And it was inspired partly because one of the council aides had read a report done in Portland, Oregon about issues of gentrification and displacement there. And so we began with that as a model for us and really built our approach on that report, which was done by Lisa Bates at Portland State University. But the first question to answer, and the one that is asked of us every time we speak about this in any sort of public forum, is, do we really need another study about this? Don't we know it's a problem? You know, why do we need to look at this? And I went back, I was looking at the council resolution that authorized the funding for the study, and the part that stood out to me after all the whereas, you know, and they finally get to the resolution, was to provide the city council with the necessary foundation for policy decisions. And we are really good in Austin at passing resolutions or producing reports that have a lot of ideas in them, but that don't really help us figure out how to prioritize and where to apply certain solutions. So we wanted to do this a little bit differently, and we wanted to start with you know, being explicit that we're looking at where should we focus our attention, what kind of actions are best matched to the conditions in specific places, and what are the trade-offs to be considered in adopting specific strategies. So what I'm going to do today is first talk some about how we defined the issues that we're studying, the approach we used, and then go through some of our findings in how we defined the areas that we think you know, we should focus on for action, and then how to navigate all the different options in terms of potential solutions. So first, the issue of gentrification. There's a lot of different definitions that are put forward. This one that I've quoted here is from a report the Brookings Institution did probably at least 10 years ago that I think captures a lot of it. The process by which higher income households displace low income residents of a neighborhood, changing the essential character of the neighborhood. So this occurs mostly through the upgrading of the housing and commercial spaces in the area, which raise property values for owners and housing costs for all residents. So there's something about it happening in a particular place, happening at a particular scale that's enough to change the character of it and causing displacement. While there's a lot of debate over whether or not gentrification brings some benefits and in terms of these rising property values and other amenities that come to the neighborhood and who receives those benefits, there's a lot of agreement on displacement being a problem and that it's something that we need to be focused on. So that's really our focus in our study. There's consensus that being involuntarily displaced from one's neighborhood can be very destabilizing and devastating, especially for people who are the least able to weather that displacement and have the fewest choices. It's a process, and we think we need to keep that in mind. It occurs over time. Conditions are set for areas to be vulnerable to displacement. Things change to make certain areas more attractive sites for development or change. So we need to think about that as we're thinking about solutions. So the first thing is just to think generally about what are some of the factors, larger issues that are shaping which areas are most vulnerable. On the left, we have a chart that comes from a recent study that's focused on a national trend that's being called the urban inversion. And the argument is that central areas are becoming more attractive to higher income households nationally. And we can see in this chart, the lines are a little bit faint, but it's showing us the relationship between distance from the central business district and housing prices at 4 different periods in time. So you can see over time that central city locations have become more and more expensive compared to the rest of the region. So there's this increasing premium being placed on these central locations. Now at the same time, we also have a history in central cities of devaluing certain areas in those cities. So there are some areas that may be particularly vulnerable to this change because of this history. And I'm showing you here Austin's redlining map, which captures just one piece of this history. But that history could also include the use of private deed restrictions starting in the 1880s here that shaped which neighborhoods were higher value by protecting them from the incursion of industrial uses, or not allowing certain uses, and also by putting racial restrictions on who was allowed to live in those neighborhoods. So we started with that. We codified that with zoning. Our first comprehensive plan created a Negro district, largely where the red area to the east of downtown is. This redlining map came out in 1937. It was meant to indicate which areas were safe to make mortgage loans to and which were considered hazardous, with the red being hazardous. And then we also did urban renewal, which were on sites that were largely in this red area. So we did some things that undervalued those areas, that made their property especially cheap and meant that people living there weren't accumulating much wealth by owning property and lived in not great conditions. And then we have overlaid on that this new interest in central living. So we have this regional scale inversion phenomena leading to neighborhood scale gentrification, which leads to displacement, especially of households that are least able to withstand rising prices. So that leads us to the next thing we had to think about. What do we mean by displacement, and what are the different forms of displacement that exist? So direct displacement is when rising housing costs push residents out. This can be through evictions, it can be by non-renewal of lease, it could be because eminent domain or demolition is removing a property from the neighborhood, or because conditions have gotten so bad in the property it's no longer habitable. But there's also a lot of what's called indirect or exclusionary displacement. And this happens as people vacate units, the rents are increased, or the units are upscaled. And so there's a lot of turnover in rental housing, especially in low-income communities. But if as someone leaves that property, it changes, it means that similar people can no longer move in. So that's what indirect or exclusionary displacement is. It's also sometimes called residential succession. And then the last one, cultural displacement, refers to the loss of sense of belonging in a place. And this can happen even if you remain in the place. So the recent research that Eric Tang did on a neighborhood in East Austin near Houston-Tillotson really revealed how a lot of lifelong residents who remained there felt, culturally displaced from the community. Okay, so once again, I want to remind us, so we're thinking about gentrification as a process that unfolds over time, where unequal treatment of particular neighborhoods or groups is part of this process, and that means that solutions should think about residents who've been displaced, current residents vulnerable to being displaced, and future residents through this exclusionary displacement. So that brings us to the issue of who is most vulnerable to displacement. In Austin right now, housing prices are generally rising. There's a lot of feeling that everybody is feeling the effects, and everybody's sort of at risk of being displaced. But so we wanted to ground this in research to make clear what we mean by vulnerability and separate that from the sort of general malaise about rising housing costs. So vulnerability is a term that's been used a lot in disaster research. It's been used to describe the inability to withstand shocks such as a natural disaster or displacement, other things that cause displacement. Housing researchers have also looked at different characteristics that are associated with housing instability and greater risk of being displaced. So based on this research, we identified a set of characteristics that we used to identify places where there were a lot of people who shared these characteristics, and therefore that place we would expect would be more vulnerable to displacement. These are also groups that, once displaced, have fewer options in terms of where they can live. So the groups we identified through research were low-income households. They have very little cushion to fall back on with how the housing prices rise, so they more quickly have to leave. People of color who even at the same income levels as others, will have fewer assets to draw on. Some of that is due to the history of segregation and discrimination. Poor households with children that Matthew Desmond's research found were more likely than other poor households to be evicted. And then once households with children are evicted, there are very few options. There are very few units in most markets that have multiple bedrooms. People without a college degree, the lower the educational level, the less the income, the more unstable the employment, which also means less of a cushion. And then renters. Renters, especially in a place like Texas where it's very easy to raise rents and there's very little protections against eviction, renters can very quickly be pushed out by rising rents. So using these factors then, we created a series of maps, and Jake took the lead on this work, and Alice created these lovely maps. So if I get anything wrong here, I'm going to direct them to you. But what we looked at first was where are neighborhoods where residents are most vulnerable to displacement. So if we look at these factors and we compare these neighborhoods defined as census tracts to the region, which areas have a disproportionate share of these groups, and we define vulnerability as having a disproportionate share of at least 3 of the groups on our list of 5. And then we scored it so that the deeper colors are where that vulnerability or the percentage or share of those groups is a lot higher than the region, and the lighter colors are, less severely different from the region. So looking at this, you can see, again, it follows the pattern that we call the Eastern Crescent in Austin. We used to talk more about an east-west divide, but we now talk more about this crescent that kind of circles around downtown. And if we looked at this over time, we would see that compared to 20 or 30 years ago, a rising share of disadvantaged people are in locations a bit farther from the urban core. So there's been this movement outward from the urban core. There are pockets of deep disadvantage. Some of you may be new to Austin. Let's see, does this have I don't think I have a pointer. But in the northern part, it's the Runberg neighborhood, kind of north central, Daffin Gin Park in northeast, Rosewood in central east, Montopolis just below the river, Franklin Park in southeast. And all of these maps, we're creating a website also that will have all of these maps and all of the pieces of our report on it, which will be rolled out soon. So you can look at them more closely. So the next question was, so we know where we have a lot of vulnerable groups, but where do we see signs that change is already occurring? And this is just such a sad picture, a pretty dramatic sign of change there. So we looked for signs that either the people living there were changing, there were demographic changes that showed us that higher income, higher educated, more often white, more often homeowner groups were moving in, which goes back to that original definition of gentrification. And the flip side of that would mean there was a decline in the groups that we said were vulnerable to being displaced. So these are the areas where we found the biggest demographic change, where we found change on 4 out of the 5 factors on our list. So these are areas where we're seeing a rise in people in home ownership, in people with a college degree or higher, in median household income, in the share of residents who are white. So you can see it's really concentrated on central neighborhoods, and it does include some of the west side neighborhoods in the center, consistent with this idea of the urban inversion that I talked about a minute ago. So the next thing we looked at then was areas showing housing market change. So we used data on home values and changes in home values over time and classified census tracts into 3 types of change. So there are places that are appreciated, so that means there's already been a big change in home values in that area. So those are the red areas. Accelerating, those are places where the housing market has really picked up steam since 2000, because we went back earlier than that in looking at these trends. So accelerating is the sort of mustard colored, and the yellow one is one little zone that didn't have home value data, so we use rent data for that area. And then adjacent areas are areas where we don't yet see a big change in home values, but they're near to areas that have either high values or high changes. So we think, the change could be coming to them soon. And again, you can see closer in, with some exceptions, are more likely to be appreciated, and the adjacent areas tend to be more on the edge. And we also see there's little change in the areas to the west and north of the central business district. And we think that's because those areas were already high value areas in 1990 and 2000. So even though they may have had price appreciation, they haven't really changed their rank in the hierarchy of neighborhoods. So then we put this all together to create a typology of gentrification in Austin neighborhoods. And we identified 5 stages of change. So at the lowest end are areas that are susceptible to change. These are largely areas where we don't yet see much change, but they're close to changing or high value areas. So we think they're susceptible. Early change areas, there's been some housing price increase, but we don't yet see a change in the demographics of the area. And those are the kind of mustard colored areas. Dynamic areas still have some vulnerable residents, but there's already some signs of change in population and housing values in those areas. The late areas, which are blue, you can see 2 of them very close to downtown. The East Riverside area very close to downtown, and then kind of the Rosewood, I think that is, or Guadalupe. In the center there's a lot more change that's happened. And then the areas we call continued loss, the dark blue, are areas that have largely transformed, but there's still some change going on. But the scale of the change is already very great. So this is where we need to focus, I think, or we think, that we need to look at this map and we need to think about what stage particular places are in and how, what kind of issues are going on there, what kind of groups need some kind of assistance. So to better understand that, for each of these, we really need to look in more depth at those areas. And we did that for 2 neighborhoods. We looked at Montopolis and just south of the river, and the St. John's Coronado area, which is kind of right next to I-35, a sort of mustardy and yellow area to the north, to use more recent data about housing prices, look at school change, all kinds of other things with whatever data we could find, to get a better sense of who the groups were there that were really the most vulnerable. And that ideally would be paired with qualitative information from the community. And we have a great example recently of such an effort in Montopolis. A group, the Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation and Austin Community Design and Development Center just did this Right to Remain report, which is in draft form because they're still getting feedback from community members about it. But they go through in more detail and look at what's happening in that community and propose a set of actions that really are addressed at what's happening there. So then that brings us to what should we do about this? And this is where we wanted to try and focus the council more on being strategic and not just adopting a report with many, many potential strategies and saying, anything they do is in that report, so that's following our recommendations. We wanted to understand more, what does it actually take to make a real difference in terms of preventing displacement, and what can we draw from that about how we should try and be more intentional here. So we decided, rather than doing the laundry list of best practices, I hate that, this is one of my pet peeves, I hate that phrase, best practices, because when you dig down, there's really not that much information behind them often. We wanted to see what worked on the ground. So we chose 3 cases that we looked at in greater depth, and we tried to choose them with these factors in mind. So we wanted places that would be somewhat like Austin rather than, Detroit or someplace that has a much weaker market. So we looked for hot market cities where the efforts were focused on neighborhoods of color, where they were really focused at a neighborhood scale, and that they took diverse approaches so we could learn about different approaches, and where the city had played some role. And then, of course, we had to remember that many things are not possible in Texas. So we tried to avoid cases that were based completely on things that we can't do in Texas. Okay. So the 3 cases that we focused on are these, and that's an image from the strategy in Portland. So we looked at Portland, Oregon, the inner northeast neighborhood, where this was a community that had a history of a lot of displacement during urban renewal. There were proposals for large-scale development in the area, and the community really objected to that. And they began this community-driven process where they actually had a specific pot of money that was going to be generated through tax increment financing funds that the community was able to then allocate and figure out what they thought should be done with it. And because of this history of urban renewal, they focused on developing a right to return policy, specifically prioritizing people who had lost their land to eminent domain during urban renewal, but also to other groups or other people that had left during that period. So we thought that one was interesting because of this very community-driven approach. They developed the plan and the priorities. They have a community oversight committee that is following how it's working over time and pushing for it to become more effective. The next one we looked at was Washington, D.C., the Columbia Heights neighborhood. In that neighborhood, they have been able to preserve a lot of rental housing and convert some of it to tenant ownership, despite large-scale redevelopment pressures, some of it caused by the city. The city put a new subway stop in there. There's a big urban Target, which was a big deal, and lots of other stuff changed there. But they managed to keep 20% of the housing in the neighborhood income restricted. And in that case, it was probably the least intentionally focused on the neighborhood of the 3 cases we looked at, but it occurred in the context of a city that has tremendous capacity to work on housing issues, that has very strong tenant rights, including the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which gives tenants right of first refusal to purchase their property if it comes up for sale, and also a lot of funding for technical assistance to make that actually happen, and a tremendous amount of resources, $100 million a year in their housing trust fund. So in that context, a lot of things happened there over time that led to a very successful preservation, we thought. And then the last one we looked at was here in Austin, in the Guadalupe neighborhood, where early efforts to push back against the redevelopment or expansion of the French legation in the 1980s resulted in city council shifting the block grant money they were giving to the French legation to make a sort of theme parkish development. They gave that money to the community, they developed a plan, and they've been very intentional in trying to work and move forward on that plan. And kind of the resources they got initially also gave them a platform to start to do that. So they're an interesting case. They've really been able to preserve a lot of the housing that existed at the time they began. A lot of additional rental housing has come to their neighborhood over time. But that one was interesting to us because it's actually here in Austin. So from these case studies, we tried to pull out some lessons. And we have a kind of longer list of lessons, but I've tried to distill them some here. The first one is that it's really critical that residents are involved, that there's a real role for residents in defining what it is that needs to be addressed and what the threats are. So in 2 of these cases, the community really had that lead role. They set priorities, identified what mattered to them. Doing that also means, though, paying attention to the capacity of organizations in those communities and residents to actually be full participants in that process and to follow implementation and monitor what's happening over time. So Portland provided a good example of how that might be done. Second, it takes a long time. The Portland case is the youngest in terms of the length of time they've been working on this. Guadalupe and Columbia Heights have both been working on this for 20 or 30 years. So over a long period, they have put together enough different strategies to maintain a lot of housing for existing residents and maintain other aspects of the community. Acting early is always better. This seems like very common sense, but it really is. So if you think about that map where we showed areas that are susceptible, that are not quite there yet, those are the areas where we have an opportunity now to buy land and hold it for social housing of some sort. But it also means that as the city does things that we know from research often feed into the pressures on these communities, they should be building in strategies for preventing displacement early on. It takes a lot of money. In all of these places over time, the amount of resources that were dedicated to these initiatives was very big. There isn't a sort of cheap solution. And in Austin, we often like to say, oh, we can do this and it won't really cost the city anything. And I generally don't believe that, because we do have to monitor and follow things. That costs something. We need capacity to do that. But if we're serious about this, we're going to have to spend a lot of money on it. We're going to have to decide that we care enough about it to do it. And then there isn't a silver bullet. We've identified a lot of things that happen in those case studies, and also lots of other ideas. And those things are all they're designed to deal with the different conditions in different places. So it's not like we can say, do this one thing and that's really going to take care of this. But one caveat is control of land is really important. So that's a good starting point for doing things. So next we were trying to think about how do we provide some sort of framework for city council so that we're not just handing them this giant list of ideas, which we do have a part of the report that's 43 pages long that is a lot of ideas. And we don't just want them to say, oh, we adopted that list, we're on our way to success. We want them to think intentionally about what are we going to do? What resources are we going to put to this? How are we going to prioritize? We have to make some tough choices. So we started by looking through all these past reports and efforts that had taken place over the years in Austin. And the first report on gentrification as an issue, I think, was in 2001. So there's really quite a long history of talking about this. And from that, we drew, we crafted a vision statement and a set of goals that we thought came out of that. We then organized the 43-page list of ideas under each of these goals. And I'll tell you the goals in a minute. And then we developed a set of criteria that could be used to evaluate the goals and help the council think about, well, do these match the situations in these particular areas or not? And what are the implications if we want to do this? What do we need to think about in terms of resources, implementation? And then we say the next step then is to develop strategies for specific neighborhoods. So this is the vision statement that we came up with that comes out of all these past reports and public conversations. Low-income residents and persons of color and their children in historically disadvantaged communities have the opportunity to stay and return to their neighborhoods in the face of rising property values and an influx of more affluent residents. Over time, opportunities remain for new low-income residents to live in the community, and residents have a meaningful role in shaping the future of their neighborhood. So it's kind of motherhood and apple pie. It's like all the things that we have said we want to do. If we just adopted this statement, what would that mean we do? There's a lot of different things in there. How do we make progress? So then we broke it down into 6 goals that require prioritization and conscious decision making. So we often say we want to prevent displacement of renters. So we've got a list of things that are specifically focused on that. We also want to prevent displacement of homeowners. We have another list that does that. We want to retain existing affordable housing in these communities. We want to plan in an inclusive way. We want to enable the return of those with ties to the community who have already been displaced, and we want to create new housing for current and future residents who are like the current residents. So these all flow from that vision, and all have been put forward as needs, but what should we prioritize and where? So we need a way to think about that. We can't just make these decisions at an abstract level, at the city level. We have to ground them in the situation of particular places. So for example, in Montopolis, and in this report and in our drill down, we found there's a lot of existing subsidized housing there. Some of it is vulnerable to being lost because it's aging out of its affordability periods and other things. We also found that there were a lot of low-income homeowners there who didn't know about the homestead exemption. So they were paying a lot higher taxes than they should have. There are many households there whose homes are in a state of disrepair, which means they could be vulnerable to losing their house. So based on the conditions they saw in that neighborhood, they had a list of things that were targeting those particular problems, which we think is going to be a more promising approach. So the next thing we did to try and help council think more clearly about this is we came up with a set of criteria, and we have a chart that has like ways to operationalize all of them, which I decided to spare you from viewing. But we want this will help them see the costs and trade-offs involved in thinking about different approaches. So the main issues are, which group is this going to help? Is it focused on renters? Is it focused on homeowners? Is it focused on families with children? What stage of gentrification does it best fit? Some things will work, most things will work pretty well in the early stages. There are fewer options in the later stages. So how does this work? Is it place-based? Because the other thing is we might say, oh, we're going to adopt some sort of home repair program citywide. That's our anti-displacement strategy. But if we kind of diffusely implement that, that's not necessarily going to result in preventing gentrification-based displacement in a community. Will it serve current or future residents, or both? And this is one of the harder ones, because in all these processes, current residents are present to represent themselves. Sometimes they're not if they've been displaced, but by and large, there's a community now voicing their concerns. Future residents are not here. Who are they? That's a harder thing to think about. How will the voices of vulnerable residents be represented in these processes? There are some approaches, the ones that are more about community planning and goal setting, that are explicitly about that. And then there are other things that are funding tools or other things where the connection to the community is less clear. And then finally, in terms of implementation, what level of funding would be required to do this? How does that compare to other things that we spend money on? And do we have the capacity to do this? Does this particular strategy we're considering require a lot of new city staff? Does it require strong community organizations that may or may not exist right now? Is it assuming residents have the knowledge or ability to do certain things? So we have to think explicitly about those things as we consider different ways to try and prevent displacement. And then to sum up, it's a very complex issue. It's an ongoing process. And in fact, the maps that we developed, part of our commitment to the city was we developed these maps. We also developed a methodology for updating them, which Jake developed, and we are giving that to them so that they can be watching this over time and seeing, like, are other neighborhoods becoming susceptible? Has this neighborhood been kind of completely transformed? What's happening in these communities? The conditions are varied across these areas, and solutions really have to be aimed at what's happening in those areas. So we can't just say, adopt these we have a 5-step plan and here it is, unless the first step is prioritizing communities and then working specifically in them to figure out what their needs are. you know, there's the difficulty of thinking about the future and how we keep a place for future residents who are not already here. So I think I already said my last point, but that's, you know, so this is kind of our rollout. This is our first attempt to try and present what we did in this report without trying to tell you about the 43 pages of specific ideas, which we can probably talk about some of them in Q&A if you want. But so there you have it.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes or so for questions. I just wanted to say a couple things that I didn't mention at the onset. I'm the sort of faculty coordinator with Dr. Chiara this year, so if you have ideas, let us know of speakers you'd like. And then big shout out to Rachel Thomas, who basically organizes the whole thing. So thanks a lot, Rachel. So let's do some questions.
Yes.
Hi. I heard you touch on this a little bit about some transparency happening between the community and policymakers and academia, as far as kind of targeting specific issues that you might have current solutions to.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering, in all your studies, did you come across any other ways to kind of bridge that gap between what's going on the ground locally with residents and kind of the ideas and other things that you guys are coming up with or policymakers are thinking about?
Well, there have been a lot of efforts. Well, there have been efforts in some communities to build these sort of community university partnerships in neighborhood centers of various sorts. And there is, in the Montopolis neighborhood, there is a proposal for is it being called a homestead preservation center? There's a proposal for such a center there that would probably work on things like doing outreach to the community to make sure everybody knows they have the right to have a homestead exemption, and you know, working on other issues there. And the university has already committed some funding to that. And I don't know that they've yet defined very well what their help might be. I'm imagining it might be in helping the community to create a plan itself. But I think, you know, that's a really good question, because some of those efforts don't work out very well. You know, if the university comes in and is very directive and kind of telling everybody what they need to do, that's not ultimately going to help out. We did look at some capacity building initiatives in other cities where they're trying to really help build the capacity of the community to participate. And one of the ones I really like from Los Angeles is this People's Planning Schools that were developed by a group called SAGE, which is Strategic Action for a Just Economy, I think is what SAGE stands for. And they've done that. Usually it's attached to things they're organizing around, but or it's helping a community often if there's some sort of community planning effort coming up or some other planning effort, and they want the residents to be able to be full participants in that. So they develop a curriculum around those issues and work with them. So I think there are ideas like that the university might be able to be a partner on, but you know, it would require some careful negotiation on roles for that. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned at some point that there is no silver bullet, but land control is one of the main tools.
Yes.
Can you say
Yeah.
more about that, and also at what level, who would be actually implementing that?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, the basic idea is the more land you can kind of remove from market pressures, the better. And that will be land that you can, you know, make into a community land trust for people to own homes on, or rental housing or other things. It just provides more options for people to be able to stay there. But it does raise the issue of who does it. Should the city purchase that land through its housing department and hold it? Should a nonprofit own it? I mean, there's different models for how you do a community land trust, and the ones where the nonprofit holds it, the residents or the board, you know, it's governed more by the community. If the city is the owner of the land, you know, that's not typically the case. So that would be a concern I would have, but it does, if the city owns it, it means it doesn't have to pay property tax, so that's a big benefit. So it's something that people are talking a lot about because we're proposing a very large, or for us, a large affordable housing bond on the next, on the November ballot. And I think they want a big chunk of that money to be dedicated to purchasing land. But that raises the issue, where? You know, how should we prioritize that? Should we be focusing on these communities? Or what about communities that have been exclusionary and never had affordable housing? Should we focus on them? You know, there's a lot of political conversations to be had there. But I think if we were developing a strategy where we said, we've picked a set of neighborhoods that we're going to focus on, purchasing land in those neighborhoods would be a really important step. Yes? Oh.
What you just said.
Mhm.
Do any of your case studies in the 43 pages talk about strategies through which you kind of offset the pressure on low-income neighborhoods by directing more dense development in higher-income neighborhoods? Or is that just kind of like more like a broad general?
We didn't really take that on. We were really intentionally focused on neighborhoods experiencing the gentrification pressure, so we didn't get into the sort of land development code issues so much. But the strategic housing blueprint does have goals for these other areas, and there are implications for that. Wait, there was one hand here and then Rochelle. Yeah.
I have a question about the data source that you're using to do your analysis and produce the maps. Are you using all publicly available Census Bureau data?
Yes.
Okay, so that's good to know. Do you envision gaining access to any data that would allow you to track individuals over time? Because I know that some really interesting research has come out of Philadelphia that does have access to data that allows the researchers to track individuals over time, and they're able to actually look at the neighborhoods when people are displaced, what neighborhoods they're moving into, and I think that tells a really interesting other part of the story that often is we're unable to get at.
Yeah.
And they found that in many cases, people who are displaced are moving to more disadvantaged, lower opportunity neighborhoods.
Huh.
Is that something that you would have the capacity to look at, or do you think that would even be an interesting phenomenon to think about in this case?
I think it'd be fascinating, but I would love to know what their data source was. I don't know, Jake, do you have an idea what that might be?
The two that I've seen, one of them is what's called, sorry if I'm getting too technical, it's called PUMS data. We talked about it in class the other day. It's really, really cool data. I use it a lot. You can't see where someone is, however, in an area that's any smaller than 100,000 people. So like with that, you could tell if someone had moved from the sort of eastern part of Austin to the far north part of Austin, but you couldn't tell if someone moved from Rosewood to Montopolis, let's say. And then the only other approach that I've heard of is using U.S. Postal Service data.
Yeah.
People have, there's
Moved
one
to,
researcher that I'm aware of from Berkeley who did that in her dissertation, but that's not it's hard, and I haven't kind of seen it widely used, but I wonder if what you're referring to is using PUMS data.
I think it's using a proprietary data set
Huh.
from credit bureau data.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh.
So,
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, I would love to get the citation to that study. Yeah, because generally once you're following individual households, they won't, they detach the spatial data from it. So it's hard to see where they're moving to and from. Rochelle?
So in addition to buying property, the city or nonprofits, did you look in detail at other kinds of regulatory techniques?
Like,
that you might
what are you thinking of?
Like density bonus programs to the extent you can in Texas. Did anyone go in and look at other, we do a lot of trading now with PUDs to get affordable housing.
Yeah.
Did you guys do any work with that?
Yeah, I mean, we did brief descriptions of a lot of ideas like that, community benefit agreements with developments. You know, we have sort of a long list of a lot of things where we have kind of a short description, some pros and cons, and then places that are actually implementing these things.
Did you identify what we're doing now and then sort of like how to improve on it? Or did
No,
you just
we-
go to,
we
like,
didn't-
toolbox?
Yeah, we did not analyze our current density bonus programs.
I
You
mean,
wanna-
the city already, has, as part of our, dearly departed code next process, the city to engage a separate set of consultants to look at all the density, I think there are 10 of them currently,
Yeah,
and they're coming forward with a proposal, I think separately from code next, to make them work better. So that would be
Yeah.
sort of duplicative for
Are
us to.
Yeah.
Are those publicly accessible, those studies on how that's working now?
I
I don't know at what
I'm sure
stage
different
it will be.
drafts have circulated in
Yeah.
different places, but I don't know exactly.
I don't know when, they will be once they complete it. I don't know what stage they're at in that. Yeah, there's been a lot, I mean, the Code Next thing was supposed to kind of redo those, but even though Code Next is sort of suspended, they're still trying to fix that.
This is great, by
Yeah.
the way.
Oh,
I mean,
thanks.
this is great. I'm just thinking how I
Yeah.
can help or if I can.
Yeah,
That's
oh,
the only reason
yeah.
why I'm asking like that.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to you more about that.
One of the things that struck me, and maybe it's just because you didn't have time to talk about it, is the sort of passive market approach. These neighborhoods are more attractive, so there's pressure on them.
Mhm.
But as a transportation person, I know that we sometimes go into those neighborhoods and put in sidewalks and put
Mhm.
in bike lanes.
Yep.
And do a bunch of things
Yeah,
that in fact make the process
Yeah.
worse.
yes,
And that seems like a horrible catch-22.
yes,
Like, keep your crappy sidewalks so
Yeah.
rich white people don't wanna come
Yeah.
to your neighborhood.
yeah,
But that's putting all sorts of people who live there at a terrible disadvantage. Their kids aren't safe to walk to
Yeah.
school, and there's unsafe intersections. And is there some way to tie physical improvements in those communities to safeguarding? And the
Yeah.
value of the property will go up, of course, if you have those
Yeah.
improvements.
Well, I think people are talking about that more in terms of corridor plans, like being very intentional as you're developing the corridor plan about what anti-displacement strategies you're going to build into that. I mean, the challenge is you really need to do that before you even tell anybody you're doing a corridor plan, because you sort of signal that things are going to change there. But yeah, that's something that we did talk about. Yeah, you and then Avais. Yeah.
You were talking about focusing on residents who had been displaced and giving them the option to move back.
Uh-huh.
In any of the case studies you looked at, had that moved from like the planning phase
To-
in theory to like a practical example of that being funded by some mechanism?
Yeah, in Portland, they're actually trying to do that. It's not working great yet, because basically what they did was they just said, if you qualify for certain programs, we will give you additional preference if you have these ties or if you had this experience during urban renewal. And so the challenge is they're not finding that many households that both have those ties and qualify for the particular program. So that's the one example that we know of that is, I think, that has moved the furthest in implementing. Can you think of anything else?
San Francisco has a right to return policy as well for some of the areas like the Western Addition that had massive displacement during the urban era.
Does it work? Has it brought people back?
I think it
or?
works maybe better than it did in Portland. I know has all kinds of problems and so forth, but I think some people have been able to benefit from those programs.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the big thing would be, how do you define who has the right to return? How are you thinking about their connections? In Portland, the fact that they had had this urban renewal experience gave them a sort of clear thing to focus on. If you don't have something as explicit as that, I think it would be a lot more complicated to work out what you mean by that. Avase, yeah. It's our famous Avase, who's been on the radio a lot recently.
What I was gonna ask was, there's a big part of it is engaging the community, inviting goals and visions.
Yeah,
And of course, you talked about how those, how to layer your goals across communities and where they are in that displacement spectrum. I mean, I'm curious to see, I'm sure you guys must have thought about this, like how do you deal with the fact of neighborhoods where a lot of change has already happened?
yes, yeah,
And then newer residents take charge
Yeah.
of that community process.
yeah,
And so then
yeah.
they start defining goals, and I mean, how do you really fight that in communities that are slightly far along?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because I think I think it would clearly be a lot easier to do in the areas that are kind of susceptible or in the earlier changes where there hasn't been a huge demographic change already. In areas that have already had that change, I'm not sure that kind of process would make sense. Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with examples of that happening in other cities, and a lot of it is around how the governance of the process works. Is it open to anyone in the community? Is it more targeted explicitly? There's plenty of case studies of gentrifiers taking over various processes. Yes, Aaron.
Should you guys have a chance to look at how housing issues might be paralleled with business issues? I know in Runberg, there's a lot of services that are geared to the diverse population that lives there, and you have, I imagine, a lot of people who are leasing. So there's some similar issues there with the idea of the services. You may be able to retain people within all the markets and places that they would go to and left. So how do you incorporate that?
We didn't really. The mayor's displacement task force does have they have 4 working groups, and they're supposed to be coming up with their recommendations, and one of them is explicitly focused on that issue. And we have not yet heard much about what they're recommending or what strategies they're following. That's a really tough issue. I remember when I was in graduate school in the 80s in Berkeley, all these people were clamoring for commercial rent control because of displacement of businesses on College Avenue and Shattuck Avenue. But I don't know of any place that's succeeded in doing that. But that goes kind of to the scale of change in a neighborhood. Once you lose a certain kind of critical mass of people, you lose those businesses that serve them as well. And that's like in Eric Tang's research on that neighborhood near Houston-Tillotson, a lot of the businesses that people used and were familiar with were leaving. Okay, one more here, and then Michael. No, you, yes.
Within the groups that you were showing as far as people that were susceptible to pressures, where did you put the older population? Because they become particularly susceptible as people are waiting for them to die and move out, so they get pressures as far as reverse mortgages and pressures from people that are aware of what they can get out of
Yes.
when their services disappear as far as care, health care.
Yeah, no, Eric Tang's study, I went to a community event where they talked about it, and there was a woman there who spoke exactly to those issues. The council, initially, one of the council members really was pushing for us to include as one of our factors for mapping vulnerability, elderly status. And we looked at that. We felt like low-income homeowners are the ones who are most vulnerable to those things. So we did try and do some mapping, and Jake maybe can say a little more about this, but ultimately I think we decided that low income was going to capture them better than trying to just to make a layer having to do with elderly. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think, to be quite blunt about it, a map of the census tracts with the most elderly people in Austin is essentially a map of the whitest and richest neighborhoods in Austin. So we thought that the people who are in the position that you're describing, we think that those people are already being disproportionately captured in the areas that we've identified. In other words, areas that have a lot of low-income homeowners will also have a lot of low-income elderly homeowners.
Yeah. for
Well,
sure.
the state also has a cap on the real estate taxes
Mhm.
after a certain age, and that.
Well,
probably
for their,
applies-
school taxes are frozen after a certain stage,
Not all of
but not all of them, yeah. Yeah, and that's another idea that we have in our laundry list here was
For
that,
their tax freezing.
yeah, the city could freeze taxes. I mean, the city taxes aren't a huge share of the taxes, but,
That helps.
yeah, yeah. And, oh, Michael, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the sort of commercial displacement issue. You have residential displacement, usually it sort of goes alongside or maybe precedes commercial displacement. The city actually is working on that in a number of ways. And I know it's kind of outside you guys' brief, but they recently passed a new kind of economic development strategy tools that's trying to deal with commercial displacement. You know, the basic solution that Austin and other cities have, because they can't really freeze rents or whatever, is they're trying to, as property values and rents for commercial owners go up, they're trying to increase demand. They
Yeah.
experience increased sales, so they're dealing with corridor issues and parking issues. And the latest thing suggests that they're going to have a kind of targeted grant and loan program for commercial. So, you know, it is kind of outside your brief, but the city is also very concerned with that. It might be kind of interesting. I mean, I think if they would benefit from the vulnerability scales that you're
Yeah.
developed, because they probably track, in some ways at least, the commercial displacement.
Those corridors.
scale. So as a way to target what the city's kind of working up on that side of the ledger,
Yeah.
it might be worth.
Is that the solely Austin? Is that
That was
program?
one thing, but they just passed this big economic development reform, and they're specifically trying to target, you know, kind of commercial vulnerability, local businesses, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And there, you know, it's technical assistance, grant and loan programs, corridor improvements to give parking, make the stores more accessible, signage, you know, physical planning, streetscape improvements, et cetera, et cetera. Solely Austin was one dimension of that, but they're doing other stuff.
Yeah. Aves?
So one thing that I think on that, I think that's a very good point on matching those, but it might be tricky. Like from my understanding, two of those districts, one is the Red River district, because they were seeing it among the music thing. So then it just completely goes against in some ways
Yeah.
the residential displacement. The other one I think they're thinking of the Fourth Street Warehouse district.
Manor Road.
Maynard matches better.
Well,
Yeah.
they did Manor Road.
Yeah, they did
Yeah.
Maynard Road, yeah. Maynard, Red River.
Which could be horse out of the barn situation. But.
Yeah.
Yeah. Be the Texas version of the problem. Yeah. Yes.
You said you went to UC Berkeley, so I was also coming from San Francisco, and a lot of the displacement that we're doing there is very much about tech. So I
Yeah.
don't know if you identified any. I know we talked about higher income and college degree holders, but are there any other major demographics of displacers that you identified? Because in SF we were dealing with the tech in Silicon Valley, and they're busing, their workers to and from, and that had a lot to do with these young people with these six-figure salaries.
Yeah.
I don't know if there was any kind of boom like that happened in Austin that is increasing people.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't specifically look at that. I mean, there's definitely, did you just move here for grad school now? Yeah. I mean, we have, is it Oracle that's building housing for their tech workers? I mean, we have some of those kind of things starting to happen.
We don't have any tech buses.
Yeah, no, and I think,
But they're living here, so they don't have to take the bus.
We have bird scooters.
yeah, they have company housing. Yeah, but our city demographer, I'm trying to think in his, he puts out a lot of information. I think Brian Kelsey's had a lot of information about where people move here from, and a lot of people move here from other parts of Texas. It's not as, like, we have this sort of mythology of these tech people from Silicon Valley are ruining everything, but it's kind of exaggerated, I think. And we do also have a lot of low-income people moving here too. Our job market is very bifurcated. So Yeah, in some ways, the housing price rise, like in many cities, seems a little bit detached from the income distribution issues. It's not completely aligned. So, other questions? You all ready to get out there and figure this out? All right, well,
Okay, thanks a
thanks.
lot.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow.